Hey guys, welcome. I recently finished adding gamepad support to my game Cropolution. And if you've done this before, then you'll know that one of the most painful parts of doing this is adding support for your UI. I made a video covering this topic a while back and you guys really seemed to like it, but it wasn't robust enough to handle all scenarios. So I did it again from scratch, but this time it is way more robust and it's way simpler to use as well. By the end, you're gonna have your UI elements animating. You can use your mouse, you can use a keyboard, gamepad, doesn't matter. It's all just gonna work. Ready? Let's go. So here's my starting scene. We've got a basic main menu here with several sub-menu options that we can flip through. None of these options actually do anything because this tutorial is about the UI itself, so we'll stay focused on that. Now the setup does matter, so this part is important. You'll notice that we have a canvas here, and inside of it is a separate game object for each sub-menu. We've got our main menu, controls menu, audio menu, and graphics menu, each of which is simply enabled and disabled at runtime. What we're going to end up with is one script which will add to each of these sub-menu game objects. And that script will be responsible for handling every single UI element inside of it. So we're going to start by getting these UI elements animating first. So let's create a new script and call it menu event system handler. And I'll add it to all of our submenus here. So we'll need to add the UI namespace because we're going to create a list of selectables. Selectable is the base class for buttons, toggles, sliders, dropdowns, even TextMesh Pro input fields, all sorts of things. So using selectable will allow us to basically plug in anything. So this list will be everything on our menu that we actually want to interact with. We also want to plug in what scale we're going to be animating to and how long it will take to get there. You'll notice instead of private, I'm using protected, and all the methods in this script I'll be making virtual as well, and I'll explain why a little later. Now, because we'll eventually need to be able to look up each individual selectable's scale to properly reset it, we're going to create a dictionary that takes a selectable as the key, and it'll store a vector 3. So now we need to know what we're currently selecting so that we can actually animate it. Now, often what you'll see for this is if we add the event system's namespace, you'll add the iSelect handler and iDselect handler, which communicates with the event system in our scene to know exactly what we're currently selecting. But this is not going to work here because those interfaces need to be on the object that they are referring to, and this script will be sitting on the parent object containing all of our selectable objects. So we need another solution. So down here, create a protected virtual void called addSelectionListeners. I don't see it used that often, but Unity has a component called event trigger, and it has some familiar methods on there, select and deselect, as well as a couple others that we're going to need. So first we'll add that component if it's not already there, and then we'll add the events that we need. We create a new event trigger entry and fill out the event ID from their list of enum options. And then we'll add a callback listener to each of those. And to do that, I'm going to need to create an onSelect and onDeselect method, each of which has a base event data parameter. Then finally, we add that entry to our triggers list of trigger entries. So everything we just did, essentially what that is actually doing is adding an event trigger and then adding a callback inside of each of those with our onSelect and onDeselect methods. But we're doing it with code to save ourselves time ultimately. Now, as for what we're going to do inside of these methods, first I want to calculate what our new scale is going to be. So let's grab our current local scale from the event data, meaning whatever UI object is currently selected, and multiply that by our animation scale. And to actually do the animating, I'm going to use Dotween. It's my favorite tweening library. The free version is fantastic. I'll put a link to it down below, but get it, install it in the package manager, and then come back here. So now we'll add the dg.tweening namespace, create a variable for our two tweens, and make the scale up tween equal to transform.doScale, plugging in our new scale and the scale duration. And in the deselect, we need to get our selectable component. And we'll call doScale. And this time we'll grab the correct scale based on the dictionary that we set up. It's very similar to working with lists, except instead of plugging in the index here, you plug in the key, which is our selectable that we just grabbed. Okay, now we need to actually call this addSelectionListeners method on all of our selectables. So in awake, we'll loop through our list of selectables and call the add selection listeners. And this is also where we'll populate our dictionaries with the scales as well. And one more thing, in onEnable, sometimes the scales do need to be reset based on how you do your UI transitions. So let's make sure that we reset all the selectable scales back to their original size, which we can do by looping through all of them and then setting their local scale to their respective value from our dictionary. And in onDisable, let's make sure we kill our tweens so that it doesn't attempt to animate something that it can't access anymore. So let's test this out. We'll plug in all of our selectables. And you'll notice that it's not quite as intuitive as we might have initially hoped. It does work, but you have to click on the button first for it to animate, which is kind of weird. That's because by default, let's just crank up this color here. If you put your mouse over a selectable, it will highlight the button, but it doesn't actually select it, which we can tell based on the colors here. So let's make an adjustment to make sure that the button is selected as soon as our mouse hovers over it, and it is deselected as soon as the mouse leaves the selectable. And again, we can use our event trigger to help us with this. We can use the pointer enter and pointer exit events. So back in our add selection listeners method, we'll add a pointer enter event and a pointer exit event. And these are handled pretty much the same way as the other events we already set up. And we'll need to create our methods for the callback listener, and I'll call them onPointerEnter and onPointerExit. Now, these are a little different because here, again, we plugged in base event data as the parameter, but what we actually need access to is the more specific pointer event data. So we're going to grab that from the event data. And we can do that because pointer event data inherits from base event data, okay? And if the pointer event data is not null, then we'll set what the currently selected object will be based on what object the pointer has entered. And in the pointer exit, same thing, except we'll set the currently selected object to null. Okay, so now let's try it. Now, depending on the setup of your project, you may or may not be seeing things animate right now, and I'll show you why. Right now, my buttons are animating just fine. However, you'll notice that my text here, it covers the entire button, and by default, every single UI element that you add to your game will have raycast target selected by default. I turned this off behind the scenes, so if we turn this back on, which is the default, you'll notice that button doesn't animate anymore because the button is being blocked by the text raycast. It's also not working on my sliders or my toggles here. But changing all of this in the inspector is a lot of work, so let's just buff up our code a bit to make this much easier. And the only thing we'll need to change is the onPointerEnter function. We'll get rid of this line here, and instead, let's try to find a selectable in the parent. And if it's null, meaning it couldn't find anything, then let's look for a selectable in the children. Then we'll set the selected object to that selected object. So now it doesn't matter how many potential raycast blocks from text and images and whatever things you might need there is, it'll just work right around those things. So I hit play, and now you can see it animates nicely as soon as the mouse touches it, and it goes back as soon as the mouse leaves it, and it's working for my sliders and toggles over here as well. And you can see all of this in action in the event system, by the way. If we set it to debug mode in the inspector, you can see the current selected changing as I highlight over different buttons. Now, if you know anything about the event system, it's that it makes it really, really easy to add keyboard and gamepad controls to your UI. You can take a look at the actions asset it has in there by default, and in the UI map, it has all sorts of control schemes pre-mapped for you. But you'll notice that right now, nothing is working for our keyboard and gamepad. And that's actually our own doing because we deselect everything as soon as our mouse leaves the UI, and the event system doesn't know where to navigate to, so we need to help it. So first, we're going to add a first selected, meaning automatically, as soon as we open a menu, which button is going to be automatically selected regardless of where the mouse is. It'll just be selected. We also want to keep track of what our last selection was as well. And finally, I also want to be able to tell when we press any button from our navigate action in our event system. If you have an input manager or anything like that in your project, I would put it in there, but for this tutorial, I'll just add it right here. To do that, we need to add the input system namespace. If you are using Unity 6, the new input system should already be installed by default, but if you're using an earlier version, then you'll need to install it from the package manager. And now we'll plug in an input action reference. So first, let's set our first selected. Through trial and error, I've learned that we need to give the UI system 1 frame to set everything up. So we'll create a coroutine that waits 1 frame and then sets the selected game object in the event system to be our first selected game object. Then in the onSelect method, we'll set the last selected as well. And finally, we need to be able to detect when we press a button from our input action reference. So we'll set up an onNavigate method with a callback context. So every time we press a navigate button, meaning up, down, left, or right, on any of the control schemes set up in our input action asset, an event will fire that will call this method. So this is how we tell the system what to select with the keyboard or the gamepad, even if there's nothing currently selected. So if the event system has nothing selected and the last selected isn't null, then we'll set the selected object to the last selected game object. Now this method, it's not going to call itself. We need to subscribe that method to the performed listener. So we'll put in our reference.action.performed. And don't forget to unsubscribe that event in the onDisable method. Very important. Okay, so let's test again. We'll need to plug in our first selected for each of them, as well as the input reference. And now we can use the mouse, switch to the keyboard, switch to the gamepad, doesn't matter, it's all just gonna work. Now, by the way, I did forget to mention that I already changed all of the colors in the selectable components. I usually like to have all different colors for normal, pressed, and selected to make it easier to tell what's currently selected, even without the animations. And also, just in case you didn't know, this navigation right here is how your event system knows where to go based on the input that you press. So it's set to automatic by default, but you can always set it explicitly if you need to as well. Now, before we wrap up, I want to add a few enhancements to our script here. But first, I said I would explain why we're using virtual methods for everything. And the reason is simply to keep this as modular as possible. For example, in my game, this script was fine for 95% of my UI screens, but there were a couple where I needed some different behaviors to happen. So for those, I simply created a new script which inherited from the base script. And now you have the option to override any of the methods that you need to. Plus, using protected instead of private variables lets us access them all still. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, now to improve this script, you might want the option to not animate certain selectables. For example, I find scroll bars and input fields to be a bit weird to animate. So let's add that functionality, and let's also make it easy to play a little sound whenever we select a button. So first we'll set up a list, and we will populate this list with everything we do not want to animate. And then we'll add the events namespace so that we can add a Unity event for the sound. So very simple, in onSelect, we'll say soundEvent.invoke. This question mark here is a shortcut for a null check. So it's just ensuring we do in fact have an event to fire, and if so, it fires it. And then we'll say if our animation exclusions contains this selected object, well then we'll return to cancel out of this method. And we'll do the exact same thing in our onDeselect. Now I've just added an audio source to my canvas with a button press sound effect. So on each script, I'll just add an event which plays the audio source. And let's just say in my graphics menu, I don't want the drop down to animate when I select it, as well as the back button. So I'll plug those in. And now you can see we've got some nice sounds playing, and in the graphics menu, everything animates except for the drop down and the back button. So that's all I got. I hope you enjoyed. And as an indie developer, I feel like it's my duty to say, check out my game Cropolution on Steam. It's coming out very soon, and give it a wish list if you want to help support our channel. That's all I got. Thanks so much.